Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Be Good Leadership. I am Ronnie Caldwell, and of course, today we're talking about everything leadership, especially in schools, and just being good for the people you lead. I want to talk about stories as culture because there's a lot that we hear about culture and building great cultures and the culture of a school, especially education, culture of a classroom, culture of the school, all those things. And I think where we lose a little bit of it is understanding that, someone kind of described culture as this is how we do things here, right? But culture also indicates what's important to us, what are the values that we actually have, what shows up, what are the things that we want to promote, right? What's the kind of place that we want to be? And many people, I think, confuse the mission statement with culture. Now, a mission statement is important. Now, the research on mission statements and how effective they are for actually creating a culture and all that kind of thing, it's kind of a wash. Sometimes mission statements don't really matter. As a matter of fact, I've been to a lot of great schools where then you ask the teachers what the actual mission statement is and they can't repeat it. Sometimes the leadership can't repeat it. But more so than the mission statement are the stories we tell about what's happening in our organization, the stories we tell about our family. A family culture is created by what are the stories we choose to remember and tell our other family members about? What are the learnings that we've had? And so I want to talk today about how we tell stories because I think it's such an important and overlooked skill is the ability to tell stories as a leader and spread stories to your staff and for your staff to be able to tell each other stories and to remind each other of what a real culture is, of what's important to your culture. And so the first thing I want to say is more so than the mission statement, the daily stories of what happens in your organization, in your school building are so important. What are the things that you share and you see? And I think as a leader, in order for us to find genuine stories, we have to be out there talking to people. We have to be in classrooms. We have to actually go around the school and talk to kids. So many of the stories that I was able to tell my staff came from the day to day interactions I would have with students and asking them about their lives, asking them about their experience in schools, being in a classroom, seeing something, listening deeply, trying to actually understand what was happening in the classroom. What were the interactions like? Noticing and really observing. We call it classroom observations, but sometimes people are just looking for things to check off the box of their evaluation form, or they're not just being present, which is fine as well. Or sometimes they're just really looking to scrutinize, as I've talked about before, and the problems with that. But more than anything, truly observing, truly being humble and curious about what is actually happening here and how many things can I observe about what's going on in the classroom, what's going on in the cafeteria here, what these students are actually telling me about their experience, what these teachers are actually talking to me about if I sit down and have lunch with them or see them in the staff lounge or just having a conversation. And it's those lessons you learn and the stories you tell based off those that have more of an influence on what your culture becomes than the mission statement itself. Now, you can always use some of the values or some of the things that are put in the mission statement to pick out the stories that are most important because sometimes those stories you can find how they relate back to respect, to global citizenship, to belonging. All that's important. But you shouldn't stop telling those stories. You shouldn't, as a leader, it is important for you to collect them. As a great leader, it is important for you to collect the stories about the daily experiences of your students, of your teachers, of your staff that speak to the culture that you want to create in the school, that speak to the values that are highest in your culture, because those stories should and will reflect that. So that's one thing. The daily stories that you collect from being involved and in and observing your actual school culture, not just in your office. And stories about messy growth. If we want people to feel good about growing, we have to share stories about messy growth. We have to share the stories about where we went wrong, what we got wrong early on. I was as an AP, I came into the job thinking to myself, you know what? I was a good teacher. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let people know what good teaching is. Man, I was not as good as I could have been. There were some experienced teachers who were very effective, who taught nothing like me. And it didn't mean that I wasn't effective. It just meant that I wasn't curious enough. I wasn't humble enough when I first got the job. And there's some people who put me in my place, not necessarily with, telling me or, having this difficult conversation with me or giving me attitude. They just kept doing what they were doing. And I was able to see, damn, these kids are learning. They're actually effective and very effective without me having to make them look like what I looked like in the classroom. And learning that there's a lot for you to still learn as an administrator. If you think about the job as an administrator, so as a teacher, we spend so little time actually watching other teachers, and then we go into administration where the job is to watch other teachers and tell them how to get better with no experience in it at all, just reading about it. And really, people get better because they want to get better. And this is just the crux of the matter, is that it seems that anyone who improves, the key thing is they need to want to improve or feel the need to do so. And it's very hard to force someone to improve. But we can actually maybe stimulate and make more of an environment where that's possible by caring about them, by wondering and asking questions about their work, by building that trust, and by sharing stories about growth, by sharing stories about continually learning, even when you think you know it all. And it's not always stories about what went right. People need to feel comfortable sharing stories about what went wrong. People need to feel comfortable about sharing, hey, I tried this and it didn't go well. And that's okay, because when people can tell stories about what didn't go well, when people can share stories about messy growth, because growth is messy, it's hardly ever just linear, they know that it's a safe place. They know that it's worthwhile to take risk. They know that if they take risk, it's not going to be the end of the world for them if it doesn't go right. And we're not going to learn unless we try. So we have to share the stories, not just about success, but about the things that didn't go quite right, that we tried, that we forgave, we remember, and we continue to grow from. Last but not least is remember that the stories speak to your values. If the only stories you share are about what went right, or a person acting as their ideal self in every single circumstance, or if you constantly only share stories about failure, if you only share stories about, man, we just didn't hit the mark, we just didn't hit the mark, we just didn't hit the mark, what are you saying to people? People think that when they constantly share stories about not hitting the mark, then they're making people want to grow. Actually, what you're usually doing is demoralizing people. Remember, people are already pretty hard on themselves anyway. I once remember watching a show. I was watching a show recently, actually, and one of the characters was a former priest, and there was another character who was a corrupt cop, and it comes to be within the course of the show, you find out this cop was a corrupt cop, and he asked the former priest. He says, "Hey, Father, am I going to get any penance? And are you going to give me my penance?" And the former priest says, "No, because I've always found that people are pretty hard on themselves anyway." And I think this is true. There's more negative self-talk than we realize anyway. And so oftentimes when we feel that, well, everyone feels like they're good enough already, I feel like there's fewer people who feel like they're good enough than there are people who are insecurely hiding where they feel like they probably need to grow, or they're not sure how good they are because they never get any feedback. No one ever sees them in class and no one ever seems to care about what they're doing. So I think that we have to be careful of the kind of stories that we share. And I think sharing stories about growth, sharing stories about, hey, this was successful. It wasn't perfect, but it was successful. Sharing stories about that are funny, sharing stories about victories as well as defeats, but rising above from that, right? Or getting better off that. You have to mix these things up, and I think you have to be realistic and playful. Playfully realistic about, man, this is hard. What we do is hard. We're going to butt up against some real challenges, but we can make it through together. If we're a little bit lighthearted about this, we forgive and remember, and we figure out from these situations what we need to do next time, we can move forward together. And creating that safety through stories reflects what you actually value. If you value respect, if you value kindness, if you value growth, if you value psychological safety, if you value belonging, your stories need to communicate that. Okay, stories are culture. And as a leader in any environment, you should be collecting stories that emphasize the values and show yourself growing towards becoming or being the culture that you want to see. As always, the advice is free and you don't have to take it. Be good.